Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, What's Happening in Washington, D.C. Politics Impacting the Animal Food Industry. I'm your moderator, Elise Schaefer, editor of Feed and Grain magazine. And our speaker today is Constance Cullman, the president and CEO of the American Feed Industry Association. Before we get started, I want to mention that Constance will have time to answer questions at the end of this webinar. You can submit them at any time during her presentation with the chat window on Zoom, and I'll ask them to her at the end. We're also recording today's webinar, and we'll be emailing you a link to that presentation shortly. Or you can go to our website, live.feedandgrain.com, and view it at the webinar archives page. And finally, I want to thank today's webinar sponsor, WEM Automation, LLC. WEM Automation is an American automation and controls company that's been providing animal nutrition manufacturing solutions since 1955. WEM systems can provide traceable process control from ingredient receiving all the way through to order loadout in either bags or bulk. You can learn more about the company at wemautomation.com. So with that, let's jump right into the presentation, and I'll turn things over to Constance.
Well, thank you so much, Elise, and thank you for the invitation to come join and chat with all of you. It's a fun time to be talking about Washington, D.C. I'm going to be very, very honest about that. We've got a lot going on. Right now, as no news to any of you, we have a very divided Congress. We've got a president that probably in many cases can best be described as embattled right now. And we're going to layer on top of that a global pandemic, not to mention a little election that's coming up in November. So I'd like to share with you just a little bit about what we're seeing. And I'm going to start with the administration and what's been happening in the White House and in the associated agencies. So prior to COVID-19 upending all of our lives, there were several different priorities that the White House had focused upon. One was trade negotiations. We had been looking at moving on to China Phase 2, having completed China Phase 1, Japan Phase 2. So we had been kind of locked out of the Japanese market as a result of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement that we had withdrawn from. And so we had actually secured access back into Japan, but now we were going to tackle some of those thorny non-tariff barriers. There was an announcement of discussions with the UK following their Brexit vote. Kenya as a potential template for how the administration was going to deal with Africa, or interact with Africa rather. The EU and then India had also been discussed. Immigration, of course, border protection was a big topic. Infrastructure, transportation, broadband, you name it. And then, of course, regulatory reform had been an ongoing consideration for the White House. And then January 21st happened, and we saw our first case of COVID-19 in the U.S. And since then, everything has been pretty much focused on the COVID response and how the administration has proceeded with dealing with that. We had the critical infrastructure guidance document that went out. Trucking received some tweaks to the regulations regarding their hours of service and the weight tolerances. FDA was doing non-issue inspection relaxation is how they had actually described it. I would say that our folks are not seeing any relaxation of the requirements for sure, just a little bit more on prioritization of who of where some of those inspections would occur, particularly with those that may have some issues or challenges. OSHA issued both a respirator guidance as well as took an unprecedented step to determine that COVID-19 was a recordable illness. So first time that that's happened, which means it is a workplace incident at this point. USDA, the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program, that had some direct support as well as purchasing and distribution. H-2A adjustments to address some of the labor shortages. The White House announced the Great American Economic Revival Industry Group. There were several members of our industry and the feed industry that are involved with that. However, they haven't met, so we haven't gotten any news on that as far as their engagement and their influence on the process. And then, of course, the biggest news in recent weeks was the executive order for meat processing facilities to actually remain open. When we take a look at the Congress and prior to COVID-19, it was healthcare and prescription drug pricing, campaign finance reform, oversight of the administration. So we were seeing a lot of hearings on that. Infrastructure, immigration, trade agreements, and then appropriations. And prior to COVID, we actually saw appropriations process moving forward actually surprisingly smoothly. And things were trucking along pretty well there. And then, of course, we saw the January 21st COVID case. Since then, it has been about trying to make sure that the resources are allocated to deal with COVID, as well as trying to get some stimulus to the economy. I get a lot of questions about the different phases, so I kind of want to run through those for you very quickly. The Phase 1 agreement was passed on March 4th. It was the Preparedness and Response Act. It allocated $8.3 billion to areas to support telehealth, community health centers, state and local response efforts, some vaccine research being done. And it also expedited FDA review process for tests and all with the objective of getting a vaccine out sooner rather than later. And then it also included some low-interest small business loans. $100 billion followed that on March 18th with the Families First Act. And this is where you started to hear more of the things that were showing up in the news. So there was assistance to food programs, more money towards testing. It definitely expanded unemployment, more low-interest small business loans to try to keep small businesses afloat when they weren't able to operate. And it also mandated 2 weeks of paid time off for companies under 500 employees. And for those same companies, created a payroll tax credit for companies. So I think there's a lot of folks that have been making sure that those are offered to employees in those smaller companies. Phase 3 was the big money. $2 trillion came out in the CARES Act. There were industry bailouts for air, travel, hotel. Direct payments to individuals. So the $1,200 stimulus check that everybody has been talking about and wondering if they'll get, if they haven't gotten. So there's been a lot of discussion about that in the media. So you've seen that. That was in this $2 trillion stimulus package. A student loan payment deferral. The Paycheck Protection Program. This was, however you can view it one of two ways. Extremely successful, because it had so many applications it ran dry in a week, or extremely not successful because it ran dry in a week. But it was something that was available to allow folks to make sure that they had the dollars to keep their folks employed and on the payrolls. It expanded some of the tax deductions. It increased unemployment pay rate. So right now, unemployment is pretty generous, which has, by the way, created some challenges for keeping people coming to work in some of the essential businesses, which is kind of interesting. It gave $49 billion to USDA. Most of that went to nutrition. $14 billion went to CCC, and about $9.5 billion went to disaster relief to producers. So this is the dollars you saw. Some went to crop producers. Lots of pork and beef and dairy, and then the poultry producers were supported through purchases. It also directed, other than giving out money, it also directed eligible investors were able to withdraw from their 401k plan to help them get through COVID, as well as extending unemployment eligibility by 13 weeks. So phase 3.5. Nobody wanted to say phase 4 was only $484 billion. So they called it phase 3.5, and it was the few things that Congress could agree on there towards the end of April. And it replenished that the payroll protection program. So that one that ran out, it put another $350 billion into that, and then $25 billion for COVID testing, agency funding, and then some idle grants and disaster loan programs. So phase 4, that's the big question. Obviously, when I sent the slides to Elise, May 4th was a possibility, but really we're probably looking at May 11th. The Senate went back this week. The House is not, so they're projected to come back next week. This phase 4 has to originate in the House. So some of the topics that are being discussed are ag nutrition, infrastructure. So Nancy Pelosi has said it's going to be at least $1 trillion. There's been a lot of interest in having infrastructure, particularly broadband. And then DeFazio would like to see waterways, inland waterways, also be included. Senator McConnell has ruled out infrastructure. We don't know whether he intends to include broadband in that or not. So it'll be interesting to see how the House and the Senate reconcile that when both are back in Washington. But it also includes funding forecast for state and local aid. So that's where Nancy Pelosi would like to see a lot of that funding, that $1 trillion funding for state and local aid. So it's going to be a really interesting discussion to see how we come out on this phase 4. So stay tuned on that. We're all watching with considerable interest as well. So when we take a look at some of the pending questions that are still out there, so, it's going to be interesting. States are doing much of the management of this crisis. You take a look at states all the way from Ohio that was declared as handling it pretty well. DeWine got out there very early in the process and really got the Ohioans' trust on things. And then you take a look at states like Florida that have received a lot of criticism. DeSantis has not been heralded as a great manager of the situation. But there have been definitely some success stories, some concerns with the way the states have handled it. But will there be federal support of state management as they begin to reopen? So that will be a key question. The state financial solvency. So this is hitting a lot of the states really hard. You take a look at the states like New York that was dealing with a very heavy hit on their population there at the beginning. And McConnell's concerns about, well, why don't you just file bankruptcy? Of course, all the states have their own independent credit rating. So that is not it's not an issue to take lightly. So that will be very interesting. And I think that's what the big battle showdown will be between Pelosi and McConnell as we look at this next phase 4 package. State legislatures, are they going to reconvene or will they remain in recess? And that will definitely have a huge impact on just day-to-day business and certainly our issues and how we interact. And then one of the big questions is, what normal business items are they still going to try to pick up? So will we get back into an appropriations process? Will we start taking a look at some of the other normal business items that have to happen in both state houses and in Congress? And then, one thing that I think is always interesting is sort of what special interest areas will be introduced. So there's certainly a lot of interest in tackling some infrastructure challenges. But then we also had Representative Pelosi float the idea of a universal income, which is something she's been interested in for quite a while, but has never gotten traction in a regular business environment. So keep your eyes open for what kind of special interest issues will come up. My guess is they'll be talked about quietly and see if there can get any traction for them before you hear a lot about them. But that will be something I think a lot of the folks that like to watch Congress and DC politics will be keeping an eye open for. And then election. And I jokingly said I almost forgot. Did you? Because until the last few days, we really haven't heard much about the fact that we've got a presidential election this fall. It's been kind of all COVID all the time. But we saw that the Democratic National Committee moved their convention to August 17th to the 20th. So moved it back quite a number of weeks to right before the Republican National Committee, which is held firm at August 24th to the 27th. Elections. So we still have our general election slated for November 3rd. If that were to be moved, I think would be one of the first times in history that we've ever moved the general election dates. Early election dates are kind of uncertain as far as primaries or some early voting. And then the big question is, will we go to remote voting if we are not fully open by the time November rolls around? And this is even a political question because we've got different opinions depending upon which party oftentimes is talking about remote voting. As you can imagine, a significant change in the way Americans vote can definitely favor one group of constituents over another's likelihood of going to the polls. So that will be very interesting to watch and observe. So taking a look at the campaigns quickly, we are down to 2 candidates. So in case with all the COVID conversation and discussions you missed it, Sanders did drop out. That makes Biden the presumptive nominee for the Democratic National Party. And so the question is going to be, who's Biden's VP choice going to be? The specter of Biden losing some of his credibility came up in the last week or so with allegations by Tara Reade of inappropriate behavior. That's going to be really tough because that's a big chunk of Biden's base and what he's positioned himself on as believing every woman. And so it will be interesting to see how that plays out in his VP choice. I think right now the big favorite is Elizabeth Warren. We also see that Biden right now is leading in general polls over Trump. Trump's lagging by 5 to 6 points right now. But again, that's the general vote. That's not the electoral vote. And we all know in the last several elections, we've seen lots of examples where the popular vote does not necessarily mean that they win the electoral colleges. So that it's going to be, in case politics weren't interesting enough, this is certainly going to change things. The question, I think, is, will there still be rallies or more media-focused campaigning? So if we're still hesitant about gathering in large groups, I can see much more focus being put on television buys, ad or radio ads, social media. So depending on which campaign could be more savvy about that. Rallies have always been a strong suit of President Trump. So that will be interesting. What will happen with debates? So we do have 3 debates scheduled, September 29th, October 15th, and the 22nd, and then the vice president debate on October 7th. I would imagine they'll probably still go forward, even if they don't have the live audiences. And then legislative races. I think primaries are definitely kind of affected as far as the voters being able to really get to know the primary candidates. And then general election campaigning is probably going to be deferred to the summer quite a bit, particularly as we see Washington empty out and those members of Congress go back to campaign. So one of the big questions is, in this very different environment, is how do we as the private sector engage with our elected officials? So the congressional schedule is really fluid. In an election year, we always kind of see them empty out in the summertime and then kind of come back after the election. Like I said, we're likely to see the House come back next week, and then some normal campaign-oriented recesses. So unless COVID keeps them in, that's why I think they're going to want to deal with phase 4 very quickly, because unless COVID keeps them in town, we won't probably see them much the rest of this year. So this spring has been very strange in Washington, because normally we have fly-ins, we have lots of people come to visit up on the Hill talking to their elected officials. There's no normal channels for reaching offices. You don't see lobbyists walk in the halls. You don't see fly-ins. There's not the normal advocacy campaigns. A lot of people are going to virtual fly-ins. So it's a very different tenor and a different way for us to have to interact. One that, quite frankly, we're not particularly savvy at in the ag sector. So I think everyone's kind of learning as quickly as they can. Contacts will more likely happen in home districts. So when people go back home and the stay-at-home restrictions get lifted, may see a lot more campaigning back in home districts. And then also PACs may become a much more strategic tool. So if they're upping their ad buys and their airtime buys, they're going to need those PAC dollars to be able to compete that way. So just very quickly, I just wanted to summarize and say, kind of what's been learned from this experience. Well, I think that the COVID experience has certainly taught us that our supply chain is strong, but it may not be nearly as flexible as would have been nice in this particular instance. Federal and state leaders better understand the importance of our sector and maintaining operations. So we've seen that from an international trade perspective, the fact that we are an economic engine of the country, and food supply security. Leaders in the public have a heightened awareness, I think, of the importance of ag. The question is, can we capitalize on that? Can we reinforce our presence in the economy? Can we reinforce our commitment and the importance of the agricultural sector? And that's on us. That's something I think that we need to make sure that we take advantage of that heightened awareness. Looking forward, we've got some examples of kind of the recovery that how it may go. China and Italy are ahead of us on the curve as far as having gone through their particular challenge. I think everyone is pretty convinced that going back to work is not necessarily going to be the same as it was before. We may have phased in. I think we're all going to be really a lot more cognizant about touching doorknobs from now on. So elections this year, I think, are going to be about the virus and the economy. So how's the economy doing? How are the handling of the virus perceived? Will we hit a second wave, and will there be a need to shut down again? And that is something I think everybody's afraid of with the economy. How do we reopen the states? We're seeing some states reopen slowly, some a little bit more quickly. And I think those states in the front row doing that are going to give us an indication of whether we can do that without seeing a spike occur again. And will this fundamentally change the way we do business and how we educate? We're all learning to adapt to this Zoom and webinars and those kinds of things. And certainly students are learning how to learn remotely. But I think it is definitely creating a more of an educational divide, particularly for those that have good broadband connection and good home resources. And then finally, leveraging the strengths and addressing the weaknesses in our supply chain. I think we're going to be coming out of this with a long list of lessons. And then how do we learn from that? And then how do we properly advocate and champion for changes that address some of the weaknesses that we discovered? So I can't talk about our government without finishing up with a quote from another government's representative, but Winston Churchill happens to be a favorite of mine, so I had to share it. So, Lisa, I'm going to turn it back over and see what kind of questions and thoughts people have. I'd love to visit with you.
All right. Thank you, Constance. That was very insightful, and we appreciate you putting that together for all of us. So just to remind the folks that you can enter a question by using the chat window in Zoom. If you just hover over the bottom, there'll be a little chat window that pops up. And if you had entered a question earlier and it didn't go through, please go ahead and try now. At this time, I do have a few questions of my own. Constance, throughout Trump's presidency, the industry has really pushed for improving the ingredient approval process for animal food. Has there been any progress made on that front?
There has. In the last appropriations bill, the industry managed to successfully advocate for an additional $5 million to go to FDA's CBM program. And that was a fantastic addition of resources because it's allowed FDA to go ahead and post for positions that will pretty much double the size of that office. One of the problems we were seeing with ingredient approvals is just kind of a backlog in review of the dossiers and a huge slowdown. We were running, there were dossiers that were taken almost 5 years as opposed to 2.5 years in other countries, which was putting us at a pretty big disadvantage. So that additional resources is going to be hugely helpful. And we have been talking with CBM and throughout all of this, and they have proceeded with filling those staffing positions. So we're quite pleased to hear that. And I think there's also work continuing to go forward to look and see how do we actually put things in place to be able to more efficiently review dossiers for approval, and then also look at new issues like production claims and the ability to get ingredients through with some of the claims that are necessary to help producers.
Great. Sounds like there has been some progress.
Yep.
Another question. You touched on this briefly in the presentation.
Mm-hmm.
Can you share how COVID and the pandemic has impacted FDA and OSHA inspections at facilities?
Yeah, I think that, there's always kind of a silver lining sometimes, Elise, in these kinds of situations. I think it's improved the communication from FDA and OSHA on inspections. And that's always been one of the bigger concerns, is just good communication. And we've been hearing from the agencies that they're really focusing on those facilities where there may be a reason to believe that there's a higher priority or a larger concern. So they're focusing more on facilities where there has been past violations or concerns, and really kind of streamlining their inspections that way. Not to say that there's been any sort of pass on safety or on feed quality or safety, but certainly there's been better communication and work on that. And so we've really appreciated that.
Excellent. Let's see, any questions coming in? I don't see any more questions, and we are just about at time. So if that's all the questions, I am going to be sending a link to everyone through chat. This is a survey link from our sponsors, and they would really appreciate if everyone could take that. Should be getting that now. And also, I want to thank all of you attendees for hopping on today for our Feed and Grain Live kickoff webinar. I would like to invite all of you to sign up for our May 27th webinar on how to do more at your facility with less staff during COVID-19. And finally, I do want to thank our sponsor, WEM. WEM has an industry-leading technical service group that's available 24/7 and can access your system remotely from their headquarters in New Berlin, Wisconsin. And remember, you can learn more about WEM at wemautomation.com. So with that, we will wrap things up. Thank you, everyone, and take care.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity, Elise, and good luck, everyone out there.